And even though the concept of dissociation in and of itself is somewhat controversial, at least hard to pin down, the connection with traumatic stress has also been quite controversial. So there's been essentially three models generically that have tried to explain the connection between trauma and dissociation. One's referred to the trauma model, the other just colloquially the fantasy model, and then one's a trans-theoretical model. So the trauma model proposes very briefly that traumatic experiences occur often early in life and via various mediators and moderators such as genetic and biological vulnerabilities, environmental circumstances such as the amount of support the person has in the aftermath of trauma or the psychological psychiatric difficulties they have going into that trauma, they will end up with pathological or maybe non-pathological dissociation as a potential outcome. The fantasy model takes just about the opposite perspective. It proposes that the capacity for dissociation in pathological and non-pathological forms via various mediators and moderators, including fantasy proneness, absent-mindedness, dysexecutive functioning, executive dysfunction or dysexecutive syndrome type issues, will then lead people to report trauma. That could be false memories of trauma, could be exaggerated memories of trauma, and they will also be more prone to suggestions from other people. That could be the media, could be therapists. So there'll be iatrogenic processes in operation. And then in more recent times, there's been proposed a trans-theoretical model, and some of the people who have written more so about the fantasy model have proposed this trans-theoretical model where the understanding is that via a combination of various psychological processes and environmental experiences, this might include sleep disturbance, traumatic stress, issues inhibiting affect, the type of affect regulation strategies utilized, that will lead to, give rise to dissociation in both traumatic forms and non-traumatic forms. So trauma-related and non-trauma-related dissociation. It was proposed that there are really two discrete sets of phenomena. And this is how, at least, dissociation is often understood at the current time. So there seems to be evidence identifying and supporting a division between two qualitatively distinct forms of dissociation, which in some literatures have been called detachment and compartmentalization. And this is thought to bring a greater clarity to what dissociation is, or that was the hope, that it would bring a greater clarity. From a different theoretical perspective, this differentiation is being called alterations in consciousness that are akin to detachment, and structural dissociation of the personality that is akin to compartmentalization. What about the future? Where do we, in a sense, go from here? Well, the first point is really not about trying to understand dissociation. I just take the liberty of making a general point, if you don't mind, and that is that there needs to be continued efforts to integrate dissociation into mainstream psychology and psychiatry. What does it look like in other disorders? So, depersonalization and derealization are quite common in panic, and people are picking this up. They're researching it more and understanding it. What type of phenomena do we get in other disorders? What does it look like? An example is, what does dissociation look like in schizophrenia? There's a lot of research now on dissociation in schizophrenia, but what does it exactly look like? How can we pull that apart a little bit more? We want to ideally have dissociation more fully represented in the classification systems. So dissociative disorders are not mentioned as differential diagnoses in many of the DSM categories. You see no mention of it in psychotic disorders, but psychotic disorders are differentially diagnosed in the dissociative disorders, and the same with the personality disorders. It seems to be largely absent as something to rule out. So we want to see greater integration, ideally, in mental health sciences, in training, for example, of practitioners in the various mental health forms that people train in. We also ideally want studies into the future that have clear theoretical underpinnings. Is this study operating from a process understanding of dissociation? Is it operating from a structural understanding? Which one? So that we can get a greater idea of where it's coming from, what its foundations are, and then being able to examine from that framework, what is the domain of dissociation? What does dissociation capture from that point of view? The future would be very good to take major theoretical frameworks in psychology and psychiatry and in neuroscience and examine what dissociation is from that perspective. And I mentioned computational psychiatry earlier, but cognitive models, emotional models, the various emotional and cognitive models. What does dissociation look like? Predictive processing models, what does it look like? Ideally, it would be really good to have so-called adversarial collaborations between scholars from different perspectives, scholars who have different perspectives on the theories that underpin dissociation. So the structural theorist working with some of the process theorists. And finally, what's the impact of social media on dissociative presentations, which I think is quite significant, but not particularly well understood. Largely because it's a fairly modern phenomenon and we don't really know too much about it. It may be that there are a number of cases that are presenting for DID now and for other dissociative problems and presenting other dissociative symptoms that actually are a bit more iatrogenic or a bit more socially derived, socio-cognitively derived from the influence of social media, for example, or chat rooms. But again, we don't really know that just yet.